The purported link between hormone-disrupting plastics chemicals like BPA and obesity was initially based in part on observations that the rise in chemical exposure seemed to coincide with the rise of the obesity epidemic, with graphs like these. But maybe that's just a coincidence. There's lots of other changes over the last half-century, like an increase in fast food consumption, watching TV, that would seem to be simpler explanations. But why are our pets getting fatter too? If Fido isn't drinking more soda. Of course, the more we watch Seinfeld reruns, the less we may walk the dog, but what about our cats? Well, maybe we're giving both them and our kids a few too many treats? That would seem an easier explanation than some pervasive obesity-causing chemical in the environment building up in the pet and person food chains. But how do we explain this? A study of over 20,000 animals from 24 populations, and we're all getting fatter. The odds of this could happen just by chance, like 1 in 10 million, large and sustained increases in body weight across the board, even in animals without access to vending machines or getting phys ed at school. So maybe some environmental pollutant is involved. Of course, we're exposed to a whole cocktail of new chemicals besides BPA, but the reason researchers have zeroed in on it is because of experiments like this, showing that BPA can accelerate the production of new fat cells, in a petri dish at least. But this was at more than 1,000 times the concentration found in most people's bloodstream. We didn't know if the same thing happened at typical levels until now. Most people have between 1 to 20 nanomoles in their blood, and even at 1 nanomole, a significant boost in human fat cell production. So even low levels may be a problem, but again, that's in a petri dish. What about in people? Why not just measure the body weights of a population exposed to the chemical compared to a population not exposed to the chemical? Because there is virtually no unexposed population. The stuff is everywhere. OK, then how about those with higher levels compared to those with lower levels? Good thinking, which is what researchers at NYU did, and the amount of BPA flowing through the bodies of children and adolescents was significantly associated with obesity. But since it was a cross-sectional study, a snapshot in time, we don't know which came first. Maybe the BPA levels didn't lead to obesity. Maybe the obesity led to high BPA levels, since the chemical is stored in fat. Or maybe BPA is just a marker for the same kinds of processed foods that can make you fat. What we need are prospective studies where you measure exposure, then follow people over time. We never had anything like that, though, until now, and indeed higher levels of BPA and other plastics chemicals were significantly associated with faster weight gain over the subsequent decade. OK, so how can we stay away from the stuff? Though we inhale some from dust, and some through our skin, touching BPA-laden receipts, 90% of exposure is from our diet. How do you tell? You have people fast and drink water only out of glass bottles for a few days, and their BPA levels drop as much as tenfold. Fasting isn't very sustainable, though. What if you did a 3-day fresh foods intervention, where they had families switch away from canned and processed foods for a few days? You can indeed get a significant drop in BPA exposure, or you can do the experiment the other way, adding a serving of canned soup to people's daily diet, and see a 1,000% rise in BPA levels in their urine compared to a serving of soup prepared with fresh ingredients. They used a ready-to-serve canned soup, which in the largest survey of North American canned foods has about 85% less BPA than condensed soups, which are even worse. But the worst of the worst appeared to be canned tuna. In a critique of the scientific validity of the dietary advice in Men's Health magazine, they discovered nuggets like this, claiming meat can give men a testosterone boost, which we've known for a quarter century, that a meal with that much fat drops testosterone levels nearly a third within hours. In fact, a significant drop of both free and bound testosterone in the bloodstream within just an hour of it going in one's mouth, whereas a low-fat meal of mostly carbs has no such effect. Based on in vitro studies on the effects of fat on testicle cells in a petri dish, they suspect fat in the blood may actually suppress testosterone production in real time. But even holding fat levels the same, if you feed people lots of meat, fish, poultry, eggs, and then switch them to a diet with about the same amount of fat, but instead bread, fruit, vegetables, and sugary junk, all their testosterone levels go up. But even more importantly, all their cortisol levels go down. Cortisol is a stress hormone produced by our adrenal glands. Having low stress hormone levels is a good thing, because high cortisol levels may strongly predict cardiovascular death in men and women, both with and without pre-existing cardiovascular disease. In fact, this may help explain death from a broken heart, the heightened heart attack and stroke risk in the immediate weeks following losing a spouse. The higher cortisol levels, days, months, or even years after losing someone you love, may increase cardiac risk and reduce immune function. And you'll note the rise in stress hormone levels losing a spouse, a bump of about 50 points, is less than the bump you may get eating a high-meat diet. Cortisol may also help explain why those who are depressed tend to put on abdominal fat. The reason obesity around the middle is associated with elevated cortisol secretion may be that abdominal fat kind of sucks it up, and so the accumulation of fat around our internal organs may be an adaptation by which our body deals with excess stress. These spikes in stress hormone levels every time we eat a lot of meat may not just affect our health, but that of our children. Substantial evidence now suggests that high-protein diets during pregnancy has adverse effects on the fetus. For example, back in the 60s, an experiment was performed on pregnant women in Motherwell, Scotland, in which they were told to eat a high-meat diet in hopes of preventing preeclampsia, a disease of pregnancy. It didn't work. In fact, the lowest preeclampsia rates I've ever seen were among women eating strictly plant-based diets, only one case out of 775 pregnancies. Preeclampsia normally strikes about 5% of pregnancies, so there should have been dozens of cases, suggesting a plant-based diet could alleviate most, if not all, of the signs and symptoms of this potentially serious condition. But what did happen when pregnant women went from eating about 1 portion of meat a day to like 2 portions of meat every day? Mothers who ate more meat and fewer vegetables during pregnancy gave birth to children who grew up to have higher blood pressures. One explanation for the adverse effects of high meat and fish consumption is that this may have increased maternal cortisol concentrations, which in turn affected the developing fetus, resetting his or her stress hormone thermostat to like a higher level. But you don't know until you put it to the test, and indeed researchers found higher blood cortisol levels in both the sons and daughters of women who had reported higher meat and fish consumption, about a 5% increase for every daily meat serving. Such diets may present a metabolic stress to the mother and kind of reprogram the adrenal axis of their children, leading to lifelong hypercortisolemia, elevated levels of stress hormones in the blood. This may help explain why every daily portion of meat during late pregnancy may lead to a 1% greater fat mass in their children by the time they reach adolescence. So this could increase the risk of their children becoming obese later in life, and so have important public health implications in terms of the prevention of obesity. Now, if they're already born, you may be able to bring down their stress hormone levels with similar dietary changes. But this is just baseline stress hormone levels. Do children of mothers who ate more meat during pregnancy also have exaggerated responses to life stressors? Researchers put them through a stressful challenge, public speaking, mental arithmetic, and measured their cortisol responses. If their moms ate less than 2 servings of meat and fish a day while she was carrying them, they got little shots of stress hormones from their adrenal glands. But those whose moms ate more really got stressed out, and those whose moms ate the most, 17 or more servings a week, that's more than 2 servings of meat a day, appeared to really be quaking in their boots. So, in a way, you are what your mother ate. The prevalence of chronic diseases like diabetes has skyrocketed, as have the number of articles published about diabetes in medical journals. Why does our wealth of academic knowledge not translate more directly into making things better? Maybe it's our overattachment to the reductionistic mindset that proved so successful with acute deficiency diseases, but may actually represent an obstacle to successfully battle chronic disease, as I've touched on before. Health, these days, seems to be reduced to a highly commercialized commodity, in which we're marketed all sorts of high-cost, high-tech tests and treatments of dubious value, with substantial risks attached, which is worrisome, because most of the things that make us healthy and keep us healthy are cheap and largely available without professional help or commercial prodding. This isn't to say modern medicine can't work miracles, but what about the big picture, the 80% of death and disability caused by preventable diet-related diseases? But of course, the field of nutrition is commercialized too. It's all about profits and products, and extracting nutrients from whole foods so they can be repackaged and marketed. Yes, food is best eaten whole. For example, just eat the broccoli, the blueberries, not some brocoberry supplement. But the reason there aren't more studies on whole foods fairly obvious. You can't patent them. Why should a company spend a lot of money, time, and effort to convince you to buy broccoli when any other company can sell it to you? That's why the field of nutrition can be more about marketing profitable products than educating people about the fundamentals of health and wellness. For example, the benefits of whole grains over refined grains is commonly attributed to the fiber. This allows the food industry to whip out fiber-fortified Fruit Loops and make you feel all better. But check out this ingenious study. Burkett and colleagues thought the extraordinarily low rates of killer chronic diseases in sub-Saharan Africa was due to all the whole plant foods they were eating. This turned into the fiber hypothesis, the reductionistic thought that fiber must be the magic bullet active ingredient. Well, hey, let's put it to the test. Refined grains have some fiber left in them. So what if you compared 2 groups of older women, both getting around 6 grams of grain fiber a day, but one group mostly from whole grains, and the other mostly from refined grains? Who do you think lived longer? If it was just the fiber, there shouldn't be much difference because they ate about the same amount. But the whole grain group lived longer, significantly lower mortality rate, so this implies that it may be all the other wonderful things in whole plant foods linked to fiber that may confer important health benefits above and beyond the fiber itself. That's why fiber supplements wouldn't be expected to offer the same benefit. Food, not nutrients, is the fundamental unit in nutrition. As Dr. David Katz has pointed out, our culture doesn't want to hear that the active ingredient in broccoli is broccoli. Parkinson's disease is the second most common neurodegenerative disease after Alzheimer's. In the U.S., there are approximately 60,000 new cases diagnosed every year, bringing the total number of current cases up to about 1 million, with tens of thousands dying from it every year. The dietary component most often implicated is milk, for which contamination of milk by neurotoxins has been considered the only possible explanation. High levels of organochlorine pesticide residues have been found in milk, and in the most affected areas in the brains of Parkinson's victims on autopsy. Since pesticides in milk have been found all over, maybe the dairy industry should require toxin screenings of milk, and there are indeed now inexpensive, sensitive, portable tests available, no false positives, no false negatives, providing rapid detection of highly toxic pesticides in milk. Now we just have to convince the dairy industry to actually do it. Others, though, are not as convinced of the pesticide link, despite clear-cut associations between milk intake and the incidence of Parkinson's disease. There's no rational explanation for milk being a risk factor for Parkinson's. If it were the pesticides present in milk that could accumulate in the brain, we would assume that the pesticides would build up in the fat, and the link between skimmed milk and Parkinson's is just as strong. So they suggest reverse causation. The milk didn't cause Parkinson's, the Parkinson's caused the milk. Parkinson's makes some people depressed, they reasoned, and depressed people may drink more milk. So we shouldn't limit dairy intake in Parkinson's, especially since they are so susceptible to hip fractures. But now we know that milk doesn't appear to protect against hip fractures, after all, and may actually increase the risk of both bone fractures and death, but ironically may offer a clue as to what's going on in Parkinson's. But first, this reverse causation argument. Did milk lead to Parkinson's, or Parkinson's lead to milk? What one needs are prospective cohort studies where you measure milk consumption first, and then follow people forward over time, and such studies still found a significant increased risk associated with dairy intake. Risk increased by 17% for every small glass of milk a day, and 13% for every daily half slice of cheese. Again, the standard explanation is that it's from the pesticides and other neurotoxins in dairy, but that doesn't explain why there's more risk attached to some dairy products than others. Pesticide residues are found in all dairy products, so why should milk be associated with Parkinson's more than cheese? Well, there are other neurotoxic contaminants in milk besides the pesticides themselves, like tetrahydroisoquinolines, found in the brains of Parkinson's disease victims, but in higher levels in cheese than milk, though people may drink more milk than they eat cheese. The relationship between dairy and Huntington's appears similar. Huntington's disease is a horrible degenerative brain disease that runs in families, whose early onset may be doubled by dairy consumption. But again, this may be more milk consumption than cheese consumption. Which brings us back to the clue in the more milk, more mortality study. Anytime you hear disease risks associated with more milk than cheese, more oxidative stress, inflammation, we should think galactose, the milk sugar, rather than the milk fat, protein, or pesticides. That's why we think milk drinkers specifically appear to have higher risk of bone fractures and death, and may explain the neurodegeneration findings too, as not only do rare individuals with an inability to detoxify the galactose found in milk suffer damage to their bones, but also to their brains. The pomegranate has been revered through the ages for its medicinal properties, so much so it's been used as a symbol for some medical organizations. Fruit seems to me a better representation of health than a snake on a stick. Supposedly beneficial for a wide range of diseases, even the cannibals love it, improving the color of kid meat. No, they're talking about baby goats. It just gave me a bit of a double take when I saw this study. Most of the attention over the last decade has focused on pomegranates and prostate cancer, starting with in vitro studies, showing more and more pomegranate extract can suppress the growth of prostate cancer cells in a petri dish by up to 95%. What about normal prostate cells? This is what normal prostate cells look like under a microscope with a little or a lot of pomegranate extract. No real difference. Doesn't seem to do much to healthy cells, but here's what prostate cancer looks like, just decimated by the pomegranate. But this was in a petri dish, not a person. Yes, if these results translated to the clinic, it could be dramatic, but first we have to try it out in people. Primary management of prostate cancer consists of either radical surgery or radiation. Now, despite this, a significant number of patients relapse and ultimately develop metastatic disease. Even after a radical prostatectomy, in about a third of the patients, the cancer comes back, as evidenced by rising PSA levels. At that point, the treatment options are limited. You already took out the prostate. The next step is essentially chemical castration, hormonal ablation. Just like breast cancer can thrive on estrogen, prostate cancer can thrive on testosterone. So you can try to wipe out testosterone, but that can have such negative side effects. Anything we can do to delay that would be good. So what about plants? They note that men in Asia have the lowest prostate cancer rates in the world, up to 10 times less than North America. Now, is this just a genetic thing? No. When Japanese individuals move to the United States and start eating and living like us, their breast and prostate cancer rates shoot up right towards ours. This could be because of what they're eating more of here. Animal products is the strongest risk factor for prostate cancer worldwide on kind of a country-by-country basis, or because of what they're eating less of here, their traditional low-fat, high-fiber diet, with soy products and green tea, and plant-rich in general. So, did these researchers try sticking these cancer patients on a plant-based diet? No, they just had them drink a cup of pomegranate juice every day. Why? Because the study was funded by the pomegranate juice folks. At least they were allowed to take it by mouth. So what happened? Well, in the 3 years leading up to the study, their cancer was steadily growing, as measured by their average PSA levels going up. Then once they started the juice, their tumors continued to grow, but it looks like they were growing slower. Now, in contrast, Dr. Dean Ornish and colleagues got an apparent reversal in early prostate cancer growth with a plant-based diet and other healthy lifestyle changes. PSA didn't just go up slower, it trended down. And dripping the blood of men on prostate cancer growing in a lab, the blood serum of those eating healthy suppressed cancer growth nearly 8 times better, whereas the blood of the men on the juice just suppressed cancer growth by about 12%. But still, to see anything just drinking a cup of juice every day is pretty impressive. The problem is there was no control group. Now, you could say they kind of acted as their own controls. This is them before and after. It's probably not just a coincidence that their tumors started growing slower right when they started the juice. But check this out. This is a drug trial trying to do the same thing. Treat men with recurring prostate cancer after surgery or radiation. In the drug group, tumor growth slowed in 55% of the men. Pretty effective drug, right? The sugar pill worked 73% of the time. The placebo effect can be so powerful that it may slow cancer growth. This is why we need placebo-controlled trials. Maybe tricking people into drinking pomegranate-flavored Kool-Aid would have the same effect, right? You think you're doing something for yourself, and so the cancer might slow. You don't know until you put it to the test. Finally, a randomized controlled trial of pomegranate juice for prostate cancer, and as you can read in the title, it had no impact. What do they mean, no impact? 25% of the cancer patients appeared to shrink their tumors as soon as they started drinking the pomegranate juice. Yeah, but 35% shrunk their tumors not drinking pomegranate juice. So any effect appears to just be a placebo. It's the same story with pomegranate extract pills. They seem to work, until they went head-to-head with sugar pills and fell flat on their face. Ginger is most famous for its role in preventing and alleviating nausea and vomiting, with so many studies now that there are reviews of reviews, not just in morning sickness, where just a half teaspoon of powdered ginger is associated with a 5-fold likelihood of improvement in nausea and vomiting in early pregnancy, but also for motion sickness, and post-operative nausea and vomiting after surgery, and preventing antiretroviral-induced nausea and vomiting during HIV treatment, and as a miracle against chemotherapy-induced vomiting. In this randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial of ginger for breast cancer chemo-induced vomiting was relieved in all phases, meaning in the acute phase within 24 hours of the chemo, delayed vomiting 2 to 3 days later, and even what's known as anticipatory vomiting, which occurs before chemotherapy sessions. After a few times the body knows what's coming and starts throwing up even at the thought of it approaching. This anticipatory nausea is something drugs can't seem to control, even the fancy new anti-nausea drugs that can cost 10,000 times more than ginger, which comes in at about 2 pennies per dose, and in certain ways may work even better. I've also talked about ginger and pain. An 1/8 teaspoon of powdered ginger, 1 penny, found to work as well as the migraine headache drug Imitrex without the side effects. And speaking of pain, ginger may also be effective as ibuprofen for alleviating menstrual cramps. Painful periods are exceedingly common and can sometimes cause severe suffering, yet have been virtually ignored by pain management researchers and practitioners. But 4 randomized controlled trials have been published on ginger for menstrual pain, and all 4 showed significant benefit when taken just the first few days of your period. Effective doses range from about 1/3 of a teaspoon a day to a full teaspoon a day, but since they all seem to work about the same, might as well just start with a penny-a-day dose. And as a side benefit, it can dramatically reduce heavy flow, which is actually one of the most common gynecological problems for young women. We know that there are pro-inflammatory foods that may contribute to heavy menstrual bleeding, so how about trying an anti-inflammatory food like ginger? Heavy menstrual bleeding is defined as more than 1/3 of a cup, or 80 milliliters. All of the study subjects started out much higher than that, but just an 1/8 teaspoon of powdered ginger 3 times a day, starting the day before their period, cut their flow in half, and it seemed to work better each month they tried it, providing a highly effective, cheap, easy-to-use, safer treatment for menstrual blood loss and pain. So, works for migraines and menstrual cramps, but just because it's effective for many types of pain doesn't mean it's necessarily efficacious for all pain. For example, how about intestinal cramps? Is ginger effective for the treatment of irritable bowel syndrome? And the answer is yes, dropping IBS severity by over 25%, but so did the placebo. So the real answer is no. Ginger is not effective for the treatment of irritable bowel syndrome. Yet, ginger is one of the most commonly used herbal medicines for irritable bowel syndrome. Silly people, don't they know it doesn't work any better than a sugar pill? Or, from another perspective, smart people using something that offers relief 53% of the time, and doesn't risk the adverse effects of some of the other drugs, with which doctors may harm 1 person for every 3 they help. Only about 1 in 10,000 people make it to be 100 years old. What's their secret? Well, in 1993, a major breakthrough in longevity research was published. A single genetic mutation that doubled the lifespan of a tiny roundworm. Instead of all being dead by 30 days, the mutants lived 60 days or longer. This lifespan extension was the largest yet reported in any organism. This Methuselah worm, medical marvel, is the equivalent of producing a healthy 200-year-old human. All because of a single mutation? That shouldn't happen. I mean, presumably aging is caused by multiple processes, many genes. How could just knocking out one gene double the lifespan? What is this aging gene anyway? This gene that so speeds up aging that if it's knocked out, the animals live twice as long. It's been called the Grim Reaper gene. What is it? It's the worm equivalent of the human IGF-1 receptor. And mutations of that same receptor in humans may help explain why some people live to be 100 and other people don't. So is it just the luck of the draw whether we got good genes or bad? No, we can turn on and off the expression of these genes depending on what we eat. 3 years ago, I profiled a remarkable series of experiments about IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, this cancer-promoting growth hormone released in excess amounts by our liver when we eat animal protein. So men and women who don't eat meat, egg white, or dairy proteins have significantly lower levels circulated within their bodies. Switching people to a plant-based diet can significantly lower IGF-1 levels within just 11 days markedly, improving the ability of women's bloodstreams to suppress breast cancer growth and then kill breast cancer cells off. Similarly, the blood serum of men on plant-based diets suppresses prostate cancer cell growth about 8 times better than before they changed their diet. This dramatic improvement in cancer defenses is, however, abolished if you add back just the amount of IGF-1 banished from their systems because they were eating and living healthier. This is one way to explain the low rates of cancer among plant-based populations. The drop in animal protein intake leads to a drop in IGF-1, which leads to a drop in cancer growth, an effect so powerful Dr. Dean Ornish and colleagues appear to be able to reverse the progression of early-stage prostate cancer without chemosurgery or radiation, just a plant-based diet and other healthy lifestyle changes. Now, when we're kids, we need growth hormones to grow. I mean, there's a rare genetic defect that causes severe IGF-1 deficiency, leading to a type of dwarfism, but also apparently makes you effectively cancer-proof. Not a single death from cancer in about 100 individuals with IGF-1 deficiency. How about 200 individuals? None developed cancer. See, most malignant tumors are covered in IGF-1 receptors, but if there's no IGF-1 around, then they may not be able to grow and spread. This may help explain why those eating low-carb diets appear to cut their lives short, but not just any low-carb diet, specifically those based on animal sources, whereas vegetable-based low-carb diets were associated with a lower risk of death. But look, low-carb diets are high in animal fat as well as animal protein, so how do we know it wasn't the saturated animal fat that was killing people off and had nothing to do with the protein? What we need is a study that just follows a few thousand people and their protein intakes for 20 years or so, and just see who lives longest, who gets cancer, who doesn't. But there'd never been a study like that until now. 6,000 men and women over age 50 from across the U.S. followed for 18 years, and those under age 65 with high protein intakes had a 75% increase in overall mortality and a 4-fold increase in the risk of dying from cancer. But not all proteins. These associations were either abolished or attenuated if the proteins were plant-derived, which all makes sense given the higher IGF-1 levels among those eating lots of protein. The sponsoring university sent out a press release with a memorable opening line, "That chicken wing you're eating could be as deadly as a cigarette," explaining that eating a diet rich in animal proteins during middle age makes you 4 times more likely to die from cancer than someone with a low-protein diet, a mortality risk factor comparable to smoking cigarettes. And when they say low-protein diet, what they actually mean is just getting the recommended amount of protein. Almost everyone's going to have a cancer cell or a precancerous cell in them at some point. The question is, does it progress? Said one of the lead researchers. That may depend on what we eat. The question is not whether a certain diet allows you to do well in the short term, one of the researchers noted, but can it help you survive to be 100? It wasn't just more deaths from cancer. Middle-aged people who eat lots of protein from animal sources were found to be more susceptible to early death in general. Crucially, the same did not apply to plant proteins like beans, and it wasn't the fat, but the animal protein that appeared to be the culprit. What was the response to the revelation that diets high in meat, eggs, and dairy could be harmful to health as smoking? Well, one nutrition scientist replied that it was potentially dangerous. It could damage the effectiveness of important public health messages. Why? Well, a smoker might think, hey, why bother quitting smoking if my ham and cheese sandwich is just as bad for me? It reminds me of a famous Philip Morris cigarette ad that tried to downplay the risk by saying, hey, you think secondhand smoke is bad, increasing the risk of lung cancer 19%. Well, hey, drinking 1 or 2 glasses of milk every day may be 3 times as bad, 62% increased risk of lung cancer. Or doubling the risk frequently cooking with oil, or tripling your risk of heart disease eating non-vegetarian, or multiplying your risk 6-fold eating lots of meat and dairy. So, they conclude, let's keep some perspective here. The risk of cancer from secondhand smoke may be well below that of other everyday activities, so breathe deep. It's like saying, yeah, don't worry about getting stabbed, because getting shot so much worse. Right? It's like saying, if you don't wear seatbelts, might as well have unprotected sex. If you go bungee jumping, might as well disconnect your smoke alarms at home. 2 risks don't make a right. Of course, you'll note Philip Morris stopped throwing dairy under the bus once they purchased Kraft Foods. That study that purported to show that diets high in meat, eggs, and dairy could be harmful to health as smoking supposedly suggested that people under 65 who eat lots of meat, eggs, and dairy are 4 times as likely to die from cancer or diabetes. But if you look at the actual study, you'll see that's simply not true. Those eating lots of animal protein didn't have 4 times more risk of dying from diabetes. They had 73 times the risk. What about those that chose moderation? Those in the moderate protein group, who got 10 to 19% of calories from protein? They just had about 23 times the risk of death from diabetes, compared to those consuming the recommended amount of protein, which comes out to be about 6 to 10% of calories from protein, around 50 or so grams a day. So the so-called low protein intake is actually the recommended protein intake, associated with a major reduction in cancer and overall mortality in middle age, under age 65. But note it says not in older populations. When it comes to diabetes deaths, lower overall protein intake is associated with a longer life at all ages, but for cancer seems to flip around age 65. These results suggest that low protein intake during middle age, followed by moderate to high protein consumption in old adults, may optimize health span and lifespan. Some have suggested that the daily allowance, standard daily allowance for protein, 0.8 grams of daily protein for every healthy kilogram of body weight, may be fine for most, but maybe older people require more. This is the study upon which the RDA was based, and though there was a suggestion that the elderly may have a somewhat higher requirement, there was just not enough evidence to make different recommendations. The definitive study was published in 2008, and it found no difference in the protein requirements between young and old. The same RDA should be adequate for the elderly. But adequate intake is not necessarily optimal intake. The protein requirement studies don't address the possibility that protein intake well above the RDA could prove beneficial, or so suggests a member of the Whey Protein Panel and a consultant for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. If you follow sedentary individuals over the age 65, they lose about 1% of their muscle mass every year. If you force people to lie in bed all day for days at a time, anyone would lose muscle mass, but older adults may lose muscle mass on bed rest 6 times faster than young people. So it's use it or lose it for everyone, but the elderly appear to lose it faster, so they better use it. The good news is, in contrast to the 12-year U.S. study, a similar study in Japan found that the age-related decreases in muscle mass were trivial. Why the difference? Turns out the participants were informed about the results of their muscle strength, and so often tried to improve it by training before their next exam for the study. Especially the men, who got so competitive, their muscle mass actually went up with age, which shows that the loss of muscle mass with age is not inevitable. You just have to put in some effort. And adding protein does not seem to help. Adding more egg whites to the diet did not influence the muscle responses to resistance training, and that's based on studies funded by the American Egg Board itself. Even the National Dairy Council couldn't spin it. Evidently, strength training induced improvements in body composition, muscle strength, and size, and physical functioning are not enhanced when older people increase their protein intake by either increasing ingestion of higher protein foods or taking protein supplements. Is there anything we can do diet-wise to protect our aging muscles? Vegetables. Consuming recommended levels of vegetables was associated with cutting the odds basically in half of low muscle mass. Why? The alkalizing effects of vegetables may neutralize the mild metabolic acidosis that occurs with age. And it may be that little extra acid in our body that facilitates the breakdown of muscle. I've talked about this before, how muscle wasting appears to be an adaptive response to acidosis. We appear to get a chronic low-grade acidosis with advancing age because our kidneys start to decline, and because we may be eating an acid-promoting diet, which means a diet high in fish, pork, chicken, and cheese, and low in fruits and vegetables. And as you can see, beans and other legumes are the only major source of protein that's alkaline instead of acid-forming. And indeed, a more plant-based diet, a more alkaline diet, was found to be positively associated with muscle mass in women aged 18 through 79 years old. So, if we are going to increase our protein consumption after age 65, it would be preferable to be plant-based proteins to protect us from frailty. No matter how old we are, a diet that emphasizes plant-based nutrition is likely to maximize health benefits in all age groups. One of the critical questions to ask when reading a medical journal article is, who funded the study? In most journals, researchers are required to identify their sources of funding, so what's the problem? Well, researchers can obscure the true origin of financial support. They can hide it, disguise it, or even launder the money through a front group. Case in point, a study downplaying the risks of lung cancer, funded in part by the Foundation for Lung Cancer Early Detection, Prevention, and Treatment. That doesn't sound so bad until you realize it's underwritten by millions from a tobacco company. See, there's no obligation to disclose a funding source of funding. This allows companies to evade financial disclosure requirements and make it harder to follow the money trail. Why does the funding source matter? Every single one of 8 reviews covering over 1,000 studies found that research funded by industry is more likely to make conclusions that are favorable to industry. For example, why do some review articles on the health effects of secondhand smoke reach different conclusions than others? The only factor was whether an author was affiliated with the tobacco industry. This is a disturbing finding. It suggests that, far from conflict of interest being unimportant in the objective and pure world of science, it may be the main factor determining the result of many studies. Not that you'd know, because 77% of authors failed to disclose the sources of funding. And that's another problem. The responsibility to disclose funding sources is left entirely up to the authors. So how many researchers divulged the truth? Evidently, a law was passed in Denmark requiring physicians to register anytime they worked with industry, which allowed researchers to cross-reference the studies they published to see how honest they were, and 48% of the time, the conflicts of interest were not disclosed, reinforcing the perception that physicians simply don't take conflict of interest seriously, or at least Danish physicians. What about the US? We didn't know until this study was published. Historically, there's been no means of confirmation or verification when an American doctor said they had no conflicts of interest. But then, in 2007, hip and knee replacement companies were forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines for giving orthopedic surgeons illegal kickbacks. Many orthopedic surgeons made decisions predicated on how much money they could make, choosing which device to implant by going to the highest bidder. We expect doctors to make decisions based on what's in the best interests of their patients, said the Department of Justice, not the best interests of their bank accounts. And part of the settlement was that they would have to make public all the payments they made to physicians. The release of those records offered a rare opportunity to see if physicians were telling the truth on disclosure forms, and lo and behold, more than half of payments were not disclosed, totaling millions of dollars. Now, this was for surgeons and medical device companies. What about doctors and drug companies? The same thing happened, where drug companies were forced to disclose who they were paying off. They looked at the publications of the doctors that got the most money, at least $100,000, and they were worse than the surgeons. In 69% of the cases, they failed to disclose their industry ties. The problem is that we just assume researchers are going to be honest and tell the truth. But these findings suggest that the accuracy and completeness of conflict of interest disclosures cannot be assumed. So even when a paper says no conflict of interest, who knows if it's really true? Longtime editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine wrote a scathing piece on drug companies and doctors who failed to disclose hundreds of thousands of dollars from drug companies like GlaxoSmithKline, which had been fined literally billions of dollars for things like bribes and suppressing data. When they got results that were commercially unacceptable, they just buried them. Billions in fines, but for drug companies that may just be the cost of doing business. As reprehensible as many drug industry practices are, the medical profession may be even more culpable. I mean, you expect drug companies to prioritize the bottom line, but maybe we should expect more from the healing profession. Who funds most of the studies that show that drugs are safe and effective? The drug companies themselves. It's self-evidently absurd to look to investor-owned companies for unbiased evaluations of their own products. One result of the bias in the medical literature is then that physicians learn to practice a very drug-intensive style of medicine. Even when lifestyle changes would be more effective, physicians and their patients often believe that for every ailment there's a drug. It's gotten so bad that physicians can no longer rely on the medical literature for valid and reliable information. Wow, that's quite an accusation. Says who? Says a longtime editor of one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. To help expose some of these conflicts of interest that are corrupting the medical profession, the Drug Company Gift Disclosure Act was introduced into Congress and died there year after year, until it was successfully integrated into the Affordable Care Act, and now there's a database detailing which doctors get the billions of dollars dished out, permitting patients to make better-informed decisions when choosing healthcare professionals and making treatment decisions. I described how you could look up your own doctor. The 2008 version that medical groups endorsed didn't require public disclosure unless doctors got $500 in gifts, but the 2009 version got even stricter, requiring disclosure if you even pocketed $100, leading groups like the American Academy of Family Physicians to start to get a little nervous. But the final wording in Obamacare requires disclosure of even a $10 meal, leading countries around the world to look to the United States of America for leadership in healthcare ethics. You don't see that every day. Now that we have this massive public record, we can now really see how honest doctors have been. The financial disclosures by the authors of the American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association guidelines were matched to the public disclosures of the hundreds of thousands of dollars they receive from Big Pharma thanks to the new law. And let's just say the overall agreement between author and drug company disclosure was poor. Nationally, female physicians each received thousands fewer dollars on average each year from drug companies, though it's not clear if that's because the women were ethical or the industry was sexist. What about conflicts of interest online? There are purportedly evidence-based medicine websites allowing physicians to answer clinical questions at the bedside. For example, a clinician caring for patients are increasingly reviewing treatment recommendations on these websites to make clinical decisions in real time. You're with a patient, you can just whip out your phone and check. So it's important that there are no financial conflicts of interest in those that write these online guidelines. So they examined one such website called UpToDate, which seemed to provide the most comprehensive diagnosis. So, did they find any conflicts of interest? Yes, in every single one they looked at. OK, but so what do you do with that information? Let's say you see an article claiming that candy consumption is not associated with health risks, and they disclosed that the research was supported by the National Confectioners Association, who used to run ads that said things like, "Put candy in their school lunch because it's good for them." The problem with financial conflicts of interest is you simply don't know what to believe. So maybe this preoccupation with disclosure hijacked the whole debate. Maybe, as the former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine critiqued, the focus should be instead on not just disclosing, but eliminating commercial conflicts. It's like campaign finance reform, where the issue is managed more by public disclosure rather than getting money out of politics. Dr. Kassirer writes that the vast attention paid to failure to disclose conflicts of interest is misplaced, and that more attention should be focused on the financial conflicts themselves. After Dr. Kassirer effectively resigned from the New England Journal of Medicine, disillusioned with the direction they were taking, Dr. Angell took over, the first female editor-in-chief in the journal's 100-year history. She lasted about a year. Medical journals consistently refer to potential conflicts of interest, she wrote, as though they were different from the real thing, and about disclosing and managing them, not about prohibiting them. In short, there seems to be a desire to eliminate the smell of corruption while keeping the money. Breaking the dependence of the medical profession on the pharmaceutical industry will take more than appointing committees. It will take a sharp break from an extremely lucrative pattern of behavior. Food cans used to be soldered with lead compounds, so much so that people living off of canned food may have died from lead poisoning. Thankfully, this is no longer a problem in the United States. Lead contamination was actually one of the first priorities of the FDA before it was even called the FDA back in 1906. It's great that newspapers now have online archives going back a century, so we can read about landmark historical events like FDA proposes lead-soldered cans be banned way back yonder in 1993, going into effect 1995. Evidently, it was complicated, because lead solder was grandfathered in as a prior sanctioned substance. Now that the lead is gone, though, are canned foods healthy? It primarily depends on what's in the can. If it's Spam Dandy, I'd probably pass. Let's give canned food the benefit of the doubt, though. What about canned fruit? Well, we know fruits and vegetables in general may help protect us from dying from cardiovascular disease, and when it comes to preventing strokes, fruit may be even more protective. But whether food processing affects this association was unknown. This study found that unprocessed produce, mostly apples and oranges, appeared superior to processed produce, but that was mainly orange and apple juice. I mean, no surprise whole fruit is better than fruit juice. What about whole fruit just in a can? Dietary guidelines encourage all fruit, fresh, frozen, and canned, but few studies have examined the health benefits of canned fruit until now. Canned fruit did not seem able to enable people to live longer. In fact, moving from fresh or dried fruit to canned fruit might even shorten one's life. So maybe dietary guidelines should stress fresh, frozen, and dried rather than canned. Why the difference? Well, there's no more lead, but there is that plastics chemical, BPA, that is used in the lining of most cans, which can leach into the food and might counterbalance some of the fruit benefits. Recently, blood levels of this chemical was associated with thickening of the lining of the arteries going up to the brains of young adults, for example. Canned fruit is often packed in syrup as well, with all that added sugar, and the canning process might diminish some nutrients, potentially wiping out 20 to 40% of the phenolic phytonutrients and about half of the vitamin C. Maybe one of the reasons citrus appears particularly protective against stroke is the vitamin C. It appears the more vitamin C in our diet, the lower our risk of stroke, and the more vitamin C in our bloodstream, the lower our risk of stroke. But how did the vitamin C get in our bloodstream? These people must have been eating a lot of healthy foods, like citrus, tropical fruits, broccoli, bell peppers. Therefore, the observed effect of vitamin C on stroke reduction may simply be a proxy for specific healthy foods that lower stroke risk. How could we tell? Well, we could just give people vitamin C pills instead and see if they work, and they don't. Citrus fruits have all sorts of other compounds associated with lower stroke risk. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You can't capture Mother Nature in a pill. It's like the apocryphal beta-carotene story. Dozens of studies show that people who ate more beta-carotene-rich foods, like greens and sweet potatoes, and therefore had more beta-carotene circulating in their system, had lower cancer risk. But how much money can we make selling carrots? So they tried giving people beta-carotene pills, and not only did they not work, they may have even caused more cancer. So I assumed this National Cancer Institute researcher would conclude the obvious: produce, not pills. But no, maybe we should have tried lower dose pills, or maybe alpha-carotene pills, or pills with other phytochemicals, or multiple combinations. After all, it's likely that neither the public nor the scientific community will be satisfied with recommendations concerned solely with mere foods. There have been about a half-dozen studies published on paleo-type diets starting around 20 years ago. In what sounds like a reality TV show, 10 diabetic Australian Aborigines were dropped off in a remote location to fend for themselves, hunting and gathering foods like figs and crocodiles. In my video on wild game, I showed that kangaroo meat causes a significantly smaller spike in inflammation compared to retail meat. Of course, ideally we'd eat anti-inflammatory foods, but wild game was significantly better. So low in fat, you can design a game-based diet with under 7% of calories from fat. Skinless chicken breast has 14 times more fat than kangaroo meat. So you can eat curried kangaroo with your cantaloupe and drop your cholesterol almost as much as eating vegetarian. So, how did they do? Well, nearly anything would have been preferable to the diet they were eating before, evidently centered around refined carbs, soda, beer, milk, and cheap fatty meat. But they did pretty good, significantly better blood sugar response thanks to a ton of weight loss. But it's because they were starving. They evidently couldn't catch enough kangaroos, and so even if they were running around the desert for 7 weeks on 1,200 calories of their original junkie diet, they may have done just as well, but we'll never know because there was no control group. Same problem with some of the other paleo studies: short, small, no control group, but favorable results were reported. No surprise, given they cut their saturated fat intake in half, presumably because they cut out so much cheese, sausage, or ice cream. Same with this one. 9 people go paleo for 10 days. They cut their saturated fat and salt intake in half, and their cholesterol and blood pressure drops, as one might expect. The longest paleo study was only 3 months until this one, 15 months, but done on pigs. It was a paleo pig study, but the pigs did better because they gained less weight on the paleo diet. Why? Because they fed the paleo group 20% fewer calories. The improvement in insulin sensitivity in pigs, though, was not reproduced in people, though there were benefits, such as improved glucose tolerance, thanks to these dietary changes. The paleo group ate less dairy, cereals, oil, and margarine, and more fruit and nuts, with no significant change in meat consumption. A follow-up study also failed to find improved glucose tolerance over control, but did show other risk factor benefits, and no wonder. Any diet cutting out dairy and donuts, oil, sugar, candy, soda, beer, and salt is likely to make people healthier and feel better. Compare these representations of a day's worth of food on a paleo diet versus the standard American diet. Although it looks like there's a tomato peeking out behind the frosted Cheerios, the paleo diet has lots of foods that actually grew out of the ground. So this kind of paleo diet would be way better. Won't it hurt people to tell them to stop eating beans, though? Hardly anyone eats beans. More than 96% of Americans don't even reach the measly minimum recommended amount, only like 1 in 200 middle-aged American women. So telling people to stop isn't going to change their diet very much. I'm all for condemning the standard American diet's refined carbs, quote-unquote non-human mammalian milk, and junk foods, but proscribing legumes is a mistake. As I've noted before, beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils may be the most important dietary predictor of survival. Beans and whole grains are the dietary cornerstones of the longest living populations on Earth. Plant-based diets in general, and legumes in particular, are a common thread among longevity blue zones around the world. The bottom line may be that reaching for a serving of kangaroo may be better than a cheese Danish, but foraging for an apple might prove to be the most therapeutic of all. Although severe iodine deficiency was eliminated in the United States nearly a century ago after the introduction of iodized salt, iodine intake has declined in recent decades. Public health efforts to limit salt intake to decrease cardiovascular risk, in conjunction with increasing use of non-iodized salt, may in part be to blame. Now, not adding salt to food is a good thing, as sodium is considered the second leading dietary killer in the world, second only to not eating enough fruit. But if you do add table salt, make sure it's iodized, as it is a myth, and often also false advertising, that so-called natural sea salt contains significant amounts of iodine. Fruits and vegetables provide iodine, but the amounts can vary depending on where it's grown, how much iodine is in the soil. Because iodine is particularly important for fetal brain development, there's a recommendation that all U.S. women who are pregnant, lactating, or even planning a pregnancy should ingest dietary supplements containing 150 micrograms of potassium iodide per day. Is there evidence that they're not getting enough now? Well, we'd like to see urine levels in pregnant women over 150, but in the U.S., pregnant women only average about 125. For example, a recent survey in New York City showed only about half of pregnant women were making the cut. Don't most women take prenatal vitamins, though? Only about half of prenatal multivitamins contain any iodine at all. And so only about 1 in 5 pregnant women in the U.S. are following the recommendations of the American Thyroid Association to take a daily iodine supplement, specifically in the form of potassium iodide rather than seaweed, as the levels in seaweed are subject to natural variability. Though the iodine content was as much as 90% off in some of the potassium iodide prenatal supplements, the kelp supplements varied even wider, off by as much as 170%. Now, the American Thyroid Association admits they don't have evidence that the current borderline insufficiency levels are leading to undesirable outcomes, and so their rationale that all pregnant women take iodine supplements is a bit tenuous. But until such data is available, they figure, better safe than sorry. A randomized, placebo-controlled interventional trial would answer the question once and for all, but the existing evidence for iodine supplementation during pregnancy is so convincing that it would be considered unethical to randomize pregnant women to a placebo. And so when it comes to sufficient iodine intake during pregnancy, I'd recommend just do it. Colorectal cancer is the 3rd most common cause of cancer death in the world. Thankfully, the good bacteria in our gut take the fiber we eat and make short-chain fatty acids like butyrate that protect us from cancer. We take care of them, they take care of us. If you do nothing to colon cancer cells, they grow. That's what cancer does. But if you expose colon cancer cells to the concentration of butyrate our good bacteria make in our gut when we eat fiber, the growth is stopped in its tracks. But if the butyrate stops, if we just eat healthy for one day and then turn off the fiber, the cancer can resume its growth. So ideally, we have to eat lots of fiber-rich foods, meaning whole plant foods, every single day. But what about the populations, like in modern sub-Saharan Africa, where they don't eat a lot of fiber, yet still rarely get colon cancer? They used to eat a lot of fiber, but now their diet is centered around highly refined cornmeal, so low fiber yet still low colon cancer rates. This was explained by the fact that while they may be lacking protective factors like fiber, they're also lacking cancer-promoting factors like animal protein and fat. But are they really lacking protective factors? If you measure the pH of their stools, the black populations in South Africa have more acidic stools. Lower pH means more acidic, despite comparable fiber intakes. As we learned before, that's a good thing. We want alkaline P, acidic poo. And that may account for the lower cancer rates. But wait a second, low colon pH is caused by short-chain fatty acids, which are produced by our good bacteria when they eat fiber. And they weren't eating any more fiber, suggesting there's something else in addition to fiber in their diets that was feeding their flora. And indeed, despite low fiber intake, the bacteria in their colon were still churning out short-chain fatty acids like crazy. But if their bacteria wasn't eating fiber, what were they eating? Resistant starch. The method of cooking and eating the cornmeal as a porridge resulted in an increase in something called resistant starch, which acts in the same way as fiber in the colon, as a prebiotic, a food for our good bacteria to produce those same cancer-preventing short-chain fatty acids. Resistant starch is any starch that resists digestion, is not digested and absorbed in the upper digestive tract, or small intestine, and so passes down into the large bowel, our colon, to feed our good bacteria. See, when you boil starches and then let them cool, some of the starch can recrystallize into a form resistant to our digestive enzymes. So we can get resistant starch eating cooled starches, pasta salad, potato salad, or cold cornmeal porridge. So this may help explain the striking differences in colon cancer rates. Thus, they were feeding their good bacteria after all, but just with lots of starch rather than fiber. Consequently, a high-carbohydrate diet may act in the same way as a high-fiber diet. Because a small fraction of the carbs make it down into our colon, the more carbs we eat, the more butyrate our gut bacteria can produce. And indeed, countries that eat the most starch have some of the lowest colon cancer rates. So fiber may not be the only protective factor. Now, only about 5% of starch may reach the colon, compared to 100% of the fiber. But we eat up to 10 times more starch than fiber, so it can potentially play a significant role feeding our flora. So we're talking about even non-resistant starch. So the protection Africans enjoy from cancer may be twofold: a diet high in resistant starch and low in animal products. Just eating more resistant starch isn't enough. See, meat contains or contributes to the production of presumed carcinogens such as N-nitroso compounds. If you split people up into 3 groups, and you put one group on a low-meat diet, second group on a high-meat diet, which includes beef, pork, poultry, and the last group on the same high-meat diet but with lots of resistant starch added, the high-meat groups had 3 times more of these presumptive carcinogens and twice the ammonia in their stool than the low-meat group, and the addition of the resistant starch did not seem to help. This confirms that exposure to these toxic compounds is increased with meat intake, and 90% was created in our bowel. So it doesn't matter if we get nitrite-free, uncured fresh meat, these nitrosamines are created from the meat as it sits in our colon. This may help explain the higher incidence of bowel cancer in meat-eating populations, along with the increase in ammonia, neither of which could be helped by just adding resistant starch on top of the meat. So the deleterious effects of animal products on colonic metabolism override the potentially beneficial effects of other protective nutrients. So we should do a combination of both more whole plant foods and less meat, along with exercise, not only for our colon, but also for general health. Resistant starch wasn't discovered until 1982. Before that, we thought all starch could be digested by the digestive enzymes in our small intestine. Subsequent studies confirmed that there are indeed starches that resist digestion and end up in our large intestine, where they can then feed our good bacteria, just like fiber does. Resistant starch is found naturally in many common foods, including grains, vegetables, beans, seeds, and some nuts. But in small quantities, just a few percent of the total. There are a few ways, though, to get some of the rest of the starch to join the resistance. When regular starches are cooked and then cooled, some of the starch recrystallizes into resistant starch. For this reason, pasta salad can be healthier than hot pasta, and potato salad can be healthier than a baked potato. But the effect isn't huge. The resistant starch goes from about 3% up to 4%. The best source of resistant starch is therefore not from eating cold starches, but from eating beans, which start out at 4 or 5 and then just go up from there. Bengal gram is just another name for garbanzo beans or chickpeas. If you mix cooked black beans with a nice fresh fecal sample, there's so much fiber and resistant starch in those beans, the pH drops as good bacteria churn out beneficial short-chain fatty acids, which are associated with lower colon cancer risk, as I've talked about both indirectly and directly. The more of this poopy black bean mixture you smear on human colon cancer, the fewer cancer cells survive. Or we can eat berries with our meals that act as starch blockers. Raspberries, for example, completely inhibit the enzyme that we use to digest starch, leaving more for our friendly flora, so putting raspberry jam on one's toast, strawberries on one's cornflakes, or making blueberry pancakes may allow one's good bacteria to share in some of the breakfast bounty. Another way to feed our good bacteria is to eat intact grains, beans, nuts, and seeds. If you split people up into two groups and have them eat the same food, but in one group, the seeds, grains, beans, and chickpeas they are eating are more or less in whole form. In the other group, they were ground up. What happens? Well, so for example, for breakfast, the whole grain group got muesli for breakfast, and the ground grain group got the same muesli, but blended up into a porridge. Similarly, the whole group, beans were like added to salads, whereas in the ground group, they were like blended up into hummus. Note, both groups were eating whole grains, not refined, whole grains. They were eating whole foods. Just in the ground grain group, the whole grains, beans, and seeds were just made into flour or blended up. So, what happened? The whole grain diet doubled their stool size, more than the ground grain diet, even though they were eating the same food, the same amount of food. Why? Because there was so much more for our good bacteria to eat. Our bacteria grew so well, they appeared to bulk up the stool. Even though people chewed their food, large amounts of apparently whole seeds were recovered from stools. But on closer inspection, they weren't whole at all. Our bacteria were having a smorgasbord. The little bits and pieces left behind after we chew them transport all the starch and goodies straight down to our good bacteria, and as a result, stool pH dropped as our bacteria were able to churn out so many more of those short-chain fatty acids. And so, whole grains are great, but intact whole grains may be even better, allowing us to feed our good gut bacteria with the leftovers. Once in our colon, starches have been found to have the same benefits as fiber, softening and bulking our stools, and reducing colon cancer risk by decreasing pH, increasing short-chain fatty acid production, reducing products of protein fermentation, also known as products of putrefaction, and decreasing secondary bile products. So, hey, if resistant starch is so great, why not just take resistant starch pills? Commercial preparations of resistant starch are now available. It should be no surprise to anyone. Food scientists have developed a number of resistant starch-enriched products. After all, it's difficult to recommend a high-fiber diet to the general public. Wouldn't it be easier to just enrich some junk food? And indeed, now you can buy Pop-Tarts bragging that they contain resistant cornstarch. But just taking resistant starch supplements does not work. There have been 2 trials so far trying to prevent cancer in people with genetic disorders that put them at extremely high risk, as in virtually 100% chance of getting cancer, and resistant starch supplements didn't help. Same here. So, we're either barking up the wrong tree, or the development of hereditary colon cancer is somehow different than regular colon cancer, or you can't emulate the effects of naturally occurring dietary fiber and plant-rich diets by just giving people some resistant starch supplement. For example, for resistant starch to work, it has to get all the way down to the end of the colon where most tumors form. But if the bacteria higher up eat it all, then it may not be protective. So we may have to also eat fiber to push it along. Thus, we either eat huge amounts of resistant starch, up near the levels in Africa, twice as much as was tried in the 2 cancer trials, or consume foods rich in both resistant starch and fiber. In other words, from a public health perspective, eating more of a variety of whole plant food rich in dietary fiber, including whole grains, vegetables, fruits, beans, is a preferable strategy for reducing cancer risk. We've known about the role of estrogen in breast cancer going back to the 1800s, when in some cases surgical removal of the ovaries seemed to help. Ovaries were said to send out mysterious influences to the rest of the body, which in 1923 we identified as estrogen. The medical profession jumped on this discovery and started injecting menopausal women by the thousands, shots that gave a respectable hook on which to hang visits to the doctor. Soon there were pills and patches, and medical journals like the Journal of the American Medical Association regaled doctors with ads on how they can help women to happiness by prescribing estrogen. You could turn this into that. For when women outlived their ovaries, there was Premarin. As far back as the 40s, concerns were raised that this practice might cause breast cancer, noting it would have been nice to figure this out first before we started dosing women en masse. But breast cancer risk didn't matter, because heart disease is the #1 killer of women, concluded reviews, and because women taking hormones appeared to have lower heart attack rates, that would outweigh the extra breast cancer. But women taking estrogen tended to be of higher socioeconomic class, tended to exercise more, and engage in other healthy lifestyle changes, like increased fiber intake and getting their cholesterol checked. So maybe that's why women taking estrogens appear to be protected from heart disease. Maybe it had nothing to do with the drugs themselves. Despite the medical profession's enthusiasm for the stuff, only a randomized clinical trial could really resolve this question. You split women into 2 groups, half get the hormones, half get a placebo, and you follow them out for a few years. But there was no such study until the 1990s, when the Women's Health Initiative study was designed. Wait a second. Why did it take the bulk of a century to decide to definitively study the safety of something that prescribed to millions of women? Maybe it's because there had never been a female director of the National Institutes of Health until then. Just 3 weeks after being named NIH director, she went before Congress to announce we need a moonwalk for women, and that moonwalk took the form of the Women's Health Initiative study. The bombshell landed. Summer 2002, there was so much more invasive breast cancer in the hormone users that they were forced to stop the study prematurely. Yeah, but what about heart disease? Wasn't that supposed to balance things out? The women didn't just have more breast cancer, they had more heart attacks, more strokes, more blood clots to their lungs. The news that women treated with hormone replacement therapy experienced higher rates of breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, and overall harm rocked women and physicians across the country. Estrogen started out as the most prescribed drug in America before the study, but the number of prescriptions dropped immediately, and within a year, so did the incidence of breast cancer in the United States. Here's the data from California, a nice drop-off in the rate of invasive breast cancer. But the most important part of this story was, why were we all so surprised? There had been decade after decade of repeated warnings about the risks of cancer. In fact, the reason breast cancer patients had so much trouble suing the drug company was that the drugs contained warning labels for decades. And having disclosed it, surely any reasonable physician would have included it in their risk and benefit discussion with their patients. It's like the warning labels on packs of cigarettes. If you get lung cancer now, you should have known better. And so if you got breast cancer, don't blame the drug company. They warned you about the risks right there, clear as day. Why didn't more doctors warn their patients? Even after the study came out, millions of prescriptions continued to be dispensed. That's a lot of cancer in our patients we caused, wrote one doctor. How long will it take us to stop listening to the drug companies, admit that we're harming many of our patients, and start changing our prescription habits? Why did this practice continue in the face of mounting evidence of harm? Well, it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Despite an overwhelming amount of evidence to the contrary, many physicians still believe that estrogenic hormones have overall health benefits, a non-evidence-based perception that may be the result of decades of carefully orchestrated corporate influence on the medical literature. Dozens of ghost-written reviews were published in medical journals to promote unproven benefits and downplay the harms of menopausal hormone therapy. They'd pay PR companies to write the articles, and then pass them off as written by some expert. So gynecologists must switch allegiance from eminence-based to evidence-based medicine. Consider what the science actually says, and not just what some so-called expert says. One might say the current culture of gynecology encourages the dissemination of health advice based on advertising rather than science. Women were placed in the way of harm by their physicians, who acted as unsuspecting patsies for the pharmaceutical companies. If we really wanted to prevent heart attacks in women, simple lifestyle behaviors can eliminate more than 90% of heart attack risk. So instead of being Big Pharma's pawns, recommending a healthful diet, increased exercise, and smoking cessation would truly benefit women's health. The concept of vitamins was first described by none other than Dr. Funk. In his landmark paper in 1912, the concept that there were complex compounds that our body couldn't make from scratch, and so had to get from our diet. By the mid-20th century, all of the vitamins had been discovered and isolated, but it wasn't until the 60s that we realized that certain fats were essential too. In 1929, the necessity for fat was definitively settled in the diet of the rat. But when one of the researchers tried a 99% fat-free diet on himself for 6 months, ironically, he felt better. His high blood pressure went away, he felt more energetic, his migraines disappeared. This one-man experiment fortified the medical profession's doubt that essential fatty acids had any relevance to human nutrition, until TPN was developed in the 1960s, total parenteral nutrition, meaning feeding someone exclusively through an IV, initially developed for babies born without working intestines. But the first preparations were fat-free, because we didn't think humans needed fat, and so they rapidly induced severe essential fatty acid deficiencies, ultimately convincing the medical community that some fats are indeed essential. They started out using safflower oil, but as they discovered in a young girl they were giving it to after an abdominal gunshot wound, we don't just need fat, but specific fats like omega-3s, and so when they switched to soybean oil, instead she was restored to normal. The fact that it took so long and under such extreme circumstances to demonstrate the essential nature of omega-3s illustrates how hard it is to develop overt omega-3 deficiency. Of course, the amount required to avoid deficiency is not necessarily the optimal amount for health. A spoonful of orange juice worth of vitamin C would be enough to avoid scurvy, the overt vitamin C deficiency disease. But no one considers that enough vitamin C for optimal health. What would optimal omega-3 status look like? Well, doubt has been cast on their role in heart health, which appears to be based on a faulty premise in the first place, and so taking extra omega-3s for our heart might not make any sense. But what about for our baby's brain? Extra DHA may not help pregnant or breastfeeding fish eaters, but those who want to avoid the contaminants in fish can take supplements of pollutant-free algae oil to get the best of both worlds for their babies. But what about adults? No apparent psychological or neurological benefit of DHA supplementation for the general public, but what about in those who don't eat fish? Take the famous alpha-omega trial. Thousands of people randomized for over 3 years to get either long-chain omega-3s from fish, short-chain omega-3s from plants, or placebo, and they found no significant benefits for any kind of omega-3 supplementation on global cognitive decline. But most were eating fish, already getting preformed DHA in their diet, and so general population studies like this that found no benefit can't fully inform us about the role of DHA in brain health, any more than giving half of these people oranges, finding no difference in scurvy rates, 0 in both groups, and concluding that vitamin C plays no role in scurvy. In 2013, for the first time, DHA supplementation was found to improve memory and reaction time among young adults who rarely ate fish. Previous randomized controlled trials failed to find such a benefit among 18 to 45-year-olds, but they all only lasted a few months at most, whereas the 2013 study lasted 6 months. So if all the studies either showed no effect or a positive effect, one might give it a try. But in one of those shorter trials, DHA supplementation didn't just fail to show benefit, it appeared to make things worse. After 50 days, those who consumed the DHA had worse memory than those taking the placebo. So out of the 6 randomized controlled trials, 4 showed nothing, 1 showed a benefit, 1 showed a harm. So if it was just about boosting brain function in the short term, I'd err on the side of caution and spend my money elsewhere. But what about preserving brain function over the long run? We are all fatheads. About half of the dry weight of our brain is fat. Lower levels of the long-chain omega-3 fat DHA in some areas of Alzheimer's brains got people thinking that maybe DHA was protective. Since the level of DHA in the brain tends to correlate with the level of DHA in the blood, one can do cross-sectional studies of dementia and pre-dementia patients, and they do tend to have lower levels of both long-chain omega-3s, EPA, and DHA circulating in their bloodstream. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that lower omega-3 levels cause cognitive impairment. It was just a snapshot in time, so you don't know which came first. Maybe the dementia led to a dietary deficiency, rather than a dietary deficiency leading to dementia. What you want is to measure long-chain omega-3 levels at the beginning, and then follow people over time, and indeed, there may be a slower rate of cognitive decline in those that start out with higher levels. And you can actually see the difference on MRI. Thousands of older men and women had their levels checked and were scanned and then rescanned, and the brains of those with higher levels looked noticeably healthier 5 years later. The size of our brain actually shrinks as we get older, starting around age 20. Between ages 16 and 80, our brain loses about 1% of its volume every 2 to 3 years, such that by the time we're in our 70s, our brain has lost 26% of its size and ends up smaller than that of 2 to 3-year-old children. As we age, our ability to make the long-chain omega-3s like DHA from the short-chain omega-3s in plant foods, such as flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts, and greens, may decline. And so researchers compared DHA levels to brain volumes in the Framingham study, and lower DHA levels were associated with smaller brain volumes. But this was just from a snapshot in time, until this study was published. Higher EPA and DHA levels correlated with larger brain volume 8 years later. While normal aging results in overall brain shrinkage, having lower long-chain omega-3s may signal increased risk. The only thing one would need now to prove cause and effect is a randomized controlled trial showing we can actually slow brain loss by giving people extra long-chain omega-3s, but the trials to date showed no cognitive benefits from supplementation until now. Double-blind, randomized interventional study providing evidence for the first time that extra long-chain omega-3s exert positive effects on brain functions in healthy older adults, a significant improvement in executive function after 6.5 months of supplementation, and significantly less brain shrinkage compared to placebo. This kind of gray matter shrinkage in the placebo might be considered just normal brain aging, but it was significantly slowed in the supplementation group. They also described changes in the white matter of the brain, increased fractional anisotropy, and decreases in mean and radial diffusivity, terms I've never heard of, but evidently they imply greater structural integrity. So, having sufficient long-chain omega-3s, EPA and DHA, may be important for preserving brain function and structure. So the next question becomes, what's sufficient, and how do you get there? The Framingham study found what appears to be a threshold value around an omega-3 index of 4.4, which is a measure of our EPA and DHA levels. Having more or much more than 4.4 didn't seem to matter, but having less was associated with accelerated brain loss, equivalent to like an extra 2 years of brain aging. That comes out to be about a teaspoon less brain matter, so it's probably good to have an omega-3 index over 4.4. The problem is that people who don't eat fish may be under 4.4. Nearly 2/3 of vegans may fall below 4, suggesting a substantial number of vegans have an omega-3 status associated with accelerated brain aging. The average American just exceeds the threshold at about 4.5, though if you age and gender match for the vegans, ironically, the omnivores did just as bad. There's not a lot of long chains and Big Macs either. But having a nutrient status no worse than those eating a standard American diet is not saying much. All we need now is a study that gives those with such low levels some pollutant-free EPA and DHA, and see how much it takes to push people past the threshold. And here we go. They took those eating vegan with levels under 4, gave them algae-derived EPA and DHA, and about 250 milligrams a day, took them from an average of 3.1 over the line to 4.8 within 4 months. And so that's why I recommend everyone eat a plant-based diet along with contaminant-free EPA and DHA to get the best of both worlds, omega-3 levels associated with brain preservation while minimizing exposure to toxic pollutants. Decades ago, concern was raised that the milk of dairy cows frequently contained a leukemia-causing virus, but they were talking about bovine leukemia, the leading cancer killer among dairy cattle. Most U.S. dairy herds are infected with the bovine leukemia virus, thus the question of whether they're releasing infectious virus into milk is an important public health consideration, so researchers at UPenn decided to put it to the test, and indeed, infectious virus was demonstrated in the milk of 17 of the 24 cows tested, indicating that humans are often exposed orally to bovine leukemia virus. But just because we're exposed doesn't mean it's causing human disease. How do we even know that BLV can even infect human cells? We didn't until 1976, when it was discovered that bovine leukemia virus can indeed infect human, chimpanzee, and monkey cells. OK, but that still doesn't mean it necessarily causes cancer in other species, though. You can't lock human infants in a cage and feed them infected milk, but you can infant chimpanzees. And chimps Bois and Roger fed the infected milk, developed leukemia, and died. We didn't even know chimps could get leukemia. The fact that BLV-infected milk appeared to transmit or induce leukemia in our closest living relatives certainly did raise the stakes, or at least impugn the safety of steaks. But human beings are not chimpanzees. Yes, our DNA may be 98% identical, but we may share 60% of our DNA with the banana. We need human studies. Thanks to the pesky Nuremberg principles, we can't do interventional trials, but what about observational studies? Do cattle ranchers have higher rates of cancer, for example? Apparently so, leading some to suggest that milk and egg-borne viruses may be important in the development of human leukemias and lymphomas. But farmers may be exposed to all sorts of potential carcinogens, such as pesticides. It's like, yes, large animal vets have more leukemia and lymphoma, but look, some were also particularly lax in the use of X-ray protective equipment, so it didn't necessarily have anything to do with animal viruses. What we needed were so-called serology studies, testing people's blood for antibodies against the virus, which would prove human exposure. And we got them. 10 different studies looking for BLV antibodies in cancer patients and non-cancer patients, creamery employees versus office employees, veterinarians, unpasteurized milk drinkers, the whole gambit, and not a single study found a single individual with antibodies to BLV. So, 1981, case closed. Strong evidence BLV is not transmissible to people. But the strength of the evidence is only as good as the strength of the test. Bois and Roger didn't develop detectable antibodies either, and they died from it. The tests back then were just really not sensitive. Clearly, the question of whether bovine leukemia virus poses a public health hazard deserves a more thorough investigation using highly sensitive molecular probes. It would take a few decades, but here it is. Up to 20% of all cancers are linked to infections, particularly viruses, and the list of potentially carcinogenic infectious agents is growing. It could be great if we found a virus that contributed to breast cancer risk, because then you might have new ways to prevent and treat it. Currently, the dietary link between meat and dairy and breast cancer is considered a saturated fat effect. But there is a cancer-causing cow virus that infects the mammary gland cells of cows. Infectious virus is then released into the milk supply. And since most U.S. dairy herds are infected, scientists figured Americans are often exposed to this bovine leukemia virus. But we didn't have proof until 2003, 34 years after the virus was first identified. Early on, our best available tests failed to find antibodies to the virus in human blood. When our immune system is exposed to a virus, it creates antibodies to attack it. No antibodies, no exposure. So this led to the prevailing opinion that this virus poses no public health hazard. Those tests were state-of-the-art at the time, but extremely insensitive compared to more modern techniques, so researchers decided to re-examine the issue now that we had better tests. So they took blood from about 250 people just to answer the question, do any humans have antibodies to bovine leukemia virus? And 191 of them did, 74%. Not that we should be surprised. By then, nearly 90% of American dairy herds were infected, and in the latest national survey, 100% of the big factory farms were infected when you test the milk coming out of those operations. So why isn't there an epidemic of udder cancer out there? Well, see, dairy cattle are hamburgered so young that there's not a lot of time for them to develop gross tumors, and that's how most women may be getting infected. Although pasteurization should knock out the virus, who hasn't eaten a pink-in-the-middle burger at some point in their life? The bottom line is that the long-held assumption that bovine leukemia virus is not a public health hazard is no longer tenable. This whole field of investigation needs to be reopened, with the next step determining whether humans are actually infected. The presence of antibodies generally interpreted as an indicator of past or present infection, but theoretically, maybe we just made antibodies to dead virus we ate, virus that had been killed by cooking or pasteurization. Just because 3/4 of us have been exposed doesn't mean we were actively infected with the virus. To prove that, we'd actually have to find the retrovirus actively stitched into our own DNA. Well, look, millions of women have gotten breast surgery. Why not just look at that tissue? Researchers did, and in 2014 published their findings in the CDC's Emerging Infectious Diseases Journal, and 44% of samples tested positive, proving for the first time that humans can be infected with bovine leukemia virus. The final step, then, is to determine if the virus is actually contributing to disease. In other words, are the bovine leukemia viruses we're finding in human breast tissue cancer-causing, or just harmless passengers? One way to figure that out is to see if the virus is more often present in those with breast cancer. but no one had ever looked for the virus in breast tissue from cancer victims until now. The presence of bovine leukemia virus DNA in breast tissues was strongly associated with diagnosed and confirmed breast cancer. As many as 37% of breast cancer cases may be attributable to BLV exposure. As many as 37% of human breast cancer cases may be attributable to exposure to bovine leukemia virus. What was the response to the revelation that as many as 37% of breast cancer cases may be attributable to exposure to bovine leukemia virus, a cancer-causing cow virus found in the milk of nearly every dairy herd in the United States? The industry pointed out that some women without breast cancer harbored the virus too. Indeed, the virus was also found in the tissues of 29% of women who did not have breast cancer, to which the researchers replied, "Yet." It can take decades before a breast tumor can be picked up by mammography, so even though they're harboring this virus in their breast and feel perfectly fine, the cancer may still be on its way. That's how other cancer-causing delta retroviruses appear to work. These viruses can make proteins that interfere with our DNA repair mechanisms. Infected cells are then more susceptible to carcinogens and slowly accumulate mutations over time. Therefore, the evidence of BLV in normal breast tissues prior to malignant and pre-malignant changes would be expected, kind of like what you see with cervical cancer, in which the causative virus is not just found in the cancerous tissue, but also the precancerous tissue and the normal tissue surrounding the malignant tumor. If bovine leukemia virus is really causing thousands of cases of breast cancer every year, then hey, since it's a retrovirus, maybe some of the antiretroviral therapies, like some of the AIDS drugs, may be able to counter the virus, but best to not get infected in the first place. The cattle industry appeared more concerned about consumer confidence than consumer cancer, a public relations brouhaha. Concerned that they might actually be forced to control these diseases in dairy cattle, and how the public would perceive it. What would control look like? Well, bovine leukemia virus is a blood-borne virus. Wait a second, then how is it spread? Is Bessie sharing dirty needles? Yes! Blood-contaminated needles and saws and gougers, pliers, taggers, knives, and tongs that they don't disinfect between animals. So if you're gouging or sawing at their heads instead of burning, they're likely to drive blood into the next animal. Or when you're sticking your arm into her rectum for artificial insemination, it's not uncommon for rectal bleeding. And then they just go from one cow to the next. More than 20 countries have successfully eradicated bovine leukemia virus from their herds by changing their practices, whereas in the US, it remains an epidemic, in part because we're not cleaning and disinfecting blood-contaminated equipment for things like supernumerary teat removal. See, extra teats detracts from the beauty of the cow. So gently pull it from the udder and cut it off with a pair of scissors. Just make sure you clean those scissors, otherwise you could be spreading bovine leukemia virus from calf to calf, and ultimately into someone's breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Of course, you could just not slice off their teats at all, but then how would you improve the appearance of their udders? It all started with this famous study published in 1980. Johns Hopkins researchers were trying to figure out why states like New Mexico and Arizona had only about half the colon cancer rates of states like New York, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Maybe it's because they got so much sun, and so they proposed that maybe the sunshine vitamin, vitamin D, is a protective factor against colon cancer. Since then, sun exposure has been associated with lower rates of 14 other types of cancer too. Vitamin D may also affect cancer survival. higher blood levels of vitamin D were associated with lower mortality of patients with colorectal cancer. How much lower? Like nearly half the mortality. And the higher the D levels, the lower the death rate appeared to fall. This may explain why the survival rate from colon cancer may depend in part on the season of diagnosis. The risk of rapid death is lowest if you're diagnosed in the fall after you've spent the summer building up your vitamin D stores. But look, there are other risk factors that could be seasonal too. Maybe people are taking advantage of the fall harvest and eating healthier. Maybe that's why lower risk in the fall season. Or maybe there's more drinking in the winter, and in the summer running around outside. Not only are you getting more sun, you're running around outside, getting more exercise, which may itself be protective. So these kind of studies just provide circumstantial evidence. Establishing a cause and effect relationship between colon cancer and vitamin D deficiency using observational studies is challenging because of confounding factors like the exercise, so-called lurking variables. For example, there may be a tight correlation between ice cream sales and drowning deaths, but that doesn't mean ice cream causes drowning. A more likely explanation is that there's a lurking third variable, like hot weather, summertime, that explains why drowning deaths are highest when ice cream consumption is highest. It's kind of a trivial example, but this actually happened with hormone replacement therapy. Women taking drugs like Premarin appeared to have 50% less risk of heart disease, and so doctors prescribe it to women by the millions. But if you dig a little deeper into the data, yes, women taking estrogen had 50% lower risk of dying from heart disease, but they also had a 50% lower risk of dying from accidents and homicide, so it probably wasn't the drug. See, the only way to know for sure is to put it to the test. In a randomized clinical trial where you give half the women the drug, see what happens, and a decade later they did. And instead of having a 50% drop in risk, within a year of being given the hormone pills, heart attack and death rates shot up 50%. In retrospect, the lurking variable was likely socioeconomic class. Poor women are less likely to be prescribed hormone replacement therapy, and more likely to be murdered and die of heart disease. Because of the lurking variable, a drug we now know to be dangerous had appeared protective. Besides lurking variables, there's also the possibility of reverse causation. Maybe low vitamin D levels didn't worsen the cancer, maybe the cancer worsened the vitamin D levels. This may be unlikely, since tumors don't appear to directly affect vitamin D levels, but cancer treatment might. Even simple knee surgery can dramatically drop vitamin D levels within hours, thought to be because of just the inflammatory insult of cutting into somebody. So maybe that could help explain the link between lower D and lower survival. And hey, if you got cancer, maybe you're spending less time running around at the beach. So yes, higher vitamin D levels are associated with improved survival in colorectal cancer and in breast cancer. In fact, about double the risk of breast cancer recurrence and death in women with the lowest vitamin D levels. And vitamin D levels also associated with longer survival with ovarian cancer and other cancers like lymphoma. But bottom line, as we learned with hormone replacement, is that you have to put it to the test. But there weren't a lot of randomized controlled trials on vitamin D supplements in cancer until now. We now have a few randomized controlled trials, and vitamin D supplements do indeed appear to reduce the risk of dying from cancer. What dose? The researchers suggest maybe getting blood levels up to at least around 75 nanomoles per liter, levels not reached by as many as 3/4 of women with breast cancer, or a striking 97% of colon cancer patients. Getting up to these kind of levels, 75 or perhaps even better, 100, might require about 2,000 to 4,000 international units of vitamin D a day, levels of intake for which there appear to be no credible evidence of harm. Regardless of what the exact level is, the findings of these kind of studies may have a profound influence on future cancer treatment. Why is the salt industry so powerful? They have their own PR and lobbying firms to play tobacco industry-style tactics to downplay the dangers. But salt is so cheap. I mean, how much money are they really making? It's not the salt mine barons, it's the processed food industry. Just like the sugar industry could care less if we buy a 2-pound bag at the store, it's the trillion-dollar processed food industry that uses the dirt-cheap added salt and sugar to sell us their junk. And by hooking us on hyper-sweet, hyper-salty foods, our taste buds get so dampened down that natural foods taste like cardboard. The ripest fruit may not be as sweet as Fruit Loops, so we just continue to buy more and more. But there are two other major reasons the food industry adds salt to food. The other two reasons, entirely commercial, and for most foods are the real reason the food industry wants the intake of salt to remain high. If you add salt to meat, it draws in water, so you can increase the weight by like 20%. And since it's sold by the pound, that's 20% more profits for very little cost. Salt also makes us thirsty. Bars offer free salted peanuts for a reason. Soda companies own snack companies for a reason. It's not just a coincidence that Pepsi and Frito-Lay are the same company. Would we shell out $9 for a drink at the movies after eating a bucket of unsalted popcorn? Would we supersize our soda if they didn't salt our fries and Big Mac? But that's not the only reason salt is added to meat. It solubilizes the muscle proteins to a gel for optimum meat texture. That's one of the reasons the meat and fish industries like the so-called meat glue enzyme, transglutaminase. Meat glue can help gel the muscle protein without adding salt. But some of these salt alternatives leave a bitter aftertaste in the meat, but this problem can be managed by also adding a bitter-blocking chemical to the meat, which work by blocking the activation of our taste receptors, preventing that information from ever reaching our brain. The meat industry acknowledges that their products contribute a significant amount of dietary sodium, maligning their image, but salt is just so cheap that using anything else would cost them money. However, if they're able to resolve this cost issue, if they can make it cost-effective, then one day maybe they could end up saving millions of lives as well as dollars. If you expose pregnant crickets to a predatory wolf spider, her babies will hatch exhibiting increased anti-predator behavior, and as a consequence, improved survival from wolf spider attack. The mother cricket appeared to be able to forewarn her babies about the threat when they were still inside her, so they would be pre-adapted to their external environment. This even happens in plants. If you grow two genetically identical plants, one in the sun, one in the shade, the sun-grown plant will produce seeds that grow better in the sun, and the shaded plant will grow seeds growing better in the shade, even though they're genetically identical. So what we're dealing with is epigenetics, external factors changing gene expression. Vole pups born in the winter come out growing thicker coats. Vole mothers are able to communicate the season to their babies in utero and tell them to put a coat on even before they're born. And people are no different. You know how different people have different temperature tolerances, resulting in battles of the bedroom? Do you turn the AC on or off, open the windows? It's not just genetics. Whether you're born in the tropics or in a cold environment determines how many active sweat glands you have in your skin. But what does this have to do with diet? Can what a pregnant woman eats permanently alter the biology of their children in terms of what genes are turned on or off throughout life, or what they don't eat? What happened to the children born during the 1945 Dutch famine imposed by the Nazis? Higher rates of obesity 50 years later. The baby's DNA gene expression reprogrammed before birth to expect to be born into a world of famine, to conserve calories at all cost. But when the war ended, this propensity to store fat became a disadvantage. What pregnant women eat and don't eat doesn't just help determine the birth weight of the child, but the future adult weight of the child. For example, maternal protein intake during pregnancy may play a role in the obesity epidemic, but not just protein in general. Protein from animal sources, primarily meat products, consumed during pregnancy, may increase the risk of their children growing up overweight. Originally, they thought it might be the IGF-1, a growth hormone boosted by animal product consumption that may increase the production of fatty tissue. But weight gain was tied more to meat than dairy. Every daily portion of meat intake during the third trimester resulted in about an extra % of body fat mass in their children by their 16th birthday, potentially increasing their risk of becoming obese later in life, independent how many calories they ate or how much they exercised. But no such link was found with cow's milk intake, which would presumably boost IGF-1 levels just as high. So maybe instead it's the obesogens in meat, chemicals that stimulate the growth of fatty tissue. Emerging evidence demonstrates that environmental factors can predispose exposed individuals to gain weight, irrespective of diet and exercise. After all, even our infants are fatter. You can't blame that on diet and exercise. Animals too, and not just our pampered pets, even rats in labs and subways. The likelihood of 24 different animal populations from 8 different species all showing a positive trend in weight over the last few decades by chance is less than 1 in a million, and so it appears there's something else going on, like obesogenic chemicals. One such candidate is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, found in cigarettes, spewing out of exhaust pipes, and in grilled meat. This nationwide study of thousands found that the more children are exposed, the fatter they tended to be. They could measure the levels of these chemicals right out of their urine, and it can start in the womb. Prenatal exposure to these chemicals may cause increased fat mass gain during childhood and a higher risk of childhood obesity. If these pollutants sound familiar, I've covered them before in relation to increasing breast cancer risk in the Long Island breast cancer study. So maybe they're not just obesogens, but carcinogens as well, perhaps explaining the 47% increase in breast cancer risk among older women in relation to a lifetime average of grilled and smoked foods. If you look at one of the most common of these toxins, smokers get about half from food and half from cigarettes. But for non-smokers, 99% comes from diet. The highest levels are found in meat, with pork apparently worse than beef, but as you can see, even dark green leafies like kale can get contaminated by pollutants in the air. So don't forage your dandelion greens next to the highway, and make sure to wash your greens under running water. Now, these are fat-soluble pollutants, so need lots of fat to be absorbed, so even heavily contaminated plant-based sources may be safer, unless you pour lots of oil on your food, in which case the toxins would presumably become as readily absorbed as the toxins in meat. The good news is that they don't build up in your body. If you expose people to barbecue chicken, At time 0 here, you can see they get a big spike in these chemicals, like up to a 100-fold increase, but your body can get rid of it within about 20 hours. The problem, of course, is that people who eat these kinds of foods every day may be constantly exposing themselves, which may not only affect their health and their children's health, but maybe even their grandchildren's health. Being pregnant during the Dutch famine didn't just lead to an increase in diseases among their kids, but even apparently their grandkids. So what a pregnant woman eats now may affect future generations. The issue of generation-spanning effects of poor conditions during pregnancy may help shed some light on the explosive epidemics of diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease associated with this transition towards Western lifestyles. In a study of the dietary advice given by newspapers in the UK, no credible scientific basis was found for most claims. The misreporting of dietary advice was found to be widespread and may contribute to public misconceptions about food and health, and potentially not just the public. Scientists like to think they're not influenced by popular media, but this study decided to put it to the test. Each week, the New York Times reports on scientific research, and the studies they report on end up being cited more often than those they don't report on. So the popular press does have an impact. Not so fast. That's just one potential explanation. Maybe outstanding articles are both more likely to be picked up by media and, independently, more likely to be cited. Maybe the newspaper was just earmarking important science, and their publicity didn't really have any effect on future studies. How could you disentangle the two? Well, an event in 1978 made it possible. There was a 3-month strike in which they continued to print copies, but could not sell them to the public. So a natural experiment was set up. If the paper was just earmarking important articles, then the strike would have no effect on the study's impact, but that's not what happened. The studies highlighted during the strike months, when no one could read them, appeared to have no impact. The next question, of course, is, are they just amplifying the medical information to the scientific community, or distorting it as well? Systematic studies suggest that many stories about new medicines, for example, tend to overstate benefits, understate risks and costs, and fail to disclose relevant financial ties. Overly rosy coverage of drugs may also result from financial ties between drug companies and the journalists themselves, who may be susceptible to big pharma perks. Scientists and physicians often blame the press. In fact, the famous physician William Osler was quoted as saying, "Believe nothing you see in the newspapers, and if you see anything in them that you know is true, begin to doubt it at once." But both parties share in the blame. Reporters may only have an hour or two to put together a story, and so they may rely on press releases, and it's not hard to imagine how drug company press releases might be biased. But surely press releases from the scientists themselves and their institutions would present the facts fairly and without spin, right? Researchers decided to put it to the test. Critics blame the media, but where do you think they're getting the information from? One might assume that press releases from prestigious academic medical centers would be measured, unexaggerated, but suffer from the same problems, downplaying side effects, conflicts of interest, study limitations, and promoting research that has uncertain relevance to human health. For example, most laboratory or animal studies explicitly claimed relevance to human health, yet lacked caveats about extrapolating results to people. For example, a release about a study of ultrasound reducing tumors in mice was titled, "Researchers Study the Use of Ultrasound for Treatment of Cancer," failing to note for your pet mouse. Apparently, it's been estimated that less than 10% of animal research ever succeeds in being translated to human clinical use. Overselling the results of lab animal studies as a promised cure potentially confuses readers and might contribute to disillusionment with science. Although it's common to blame the media for exaggerations, most times they don't just make it up. That's what the research institutions are sending out in their own press releases. And medical journals, too. Sometimes medical journal press releases do more harm than good. An analysis of press releases from some of the most prestigious medical journals found the same litany of problems. I don't think most people realize that journals sell what are called reprints, copies of the articles they print, to drug companies, which can bring in big bucks. Like drug companies may buy 1 million copies of a favorable article. Sometimes the company will submit an article and promise to buy a certain number in advance, which is effectively a bribe, notes a longtime editor-in-chief at the prestigious British Medical Journal. He remembers once when a woman from a public relations company once rang him up and stopped just short of saying she would go to bed with him if they published the paper. Another medical journal conflict of interest relates to advertising, a major source of income for many journals. Most of the advertising comes from pharmaceutical companies, and so if they don't like a study, they can threaten to withdraw their advertising, potentially leaving editors faced with the stark choice of agreeing to bury a particular piece or seeing their journal die. Even if journalists have time to skip the press releases and go straight to the source and try to read the studies themselves, they may find them utterly incomprehensible gobbledygook. But even if they do understand them, scientific articles are not simply reports of facts. Authors often have many opportunities to add spin to their scientific reports, defined as ways they can distort the interpretation of results and mislead readers, either unconsciously or with willful intent to deceive. What these researchers did was look at randomized controlled trials with statistically non-significant results, meaning some drug, for example, was compared to a sugar pill, and the difference between the newfangled treatment and placebo was essentially non-existent. Would the researchers just lay out the truth and be like, oh, well, we spent all this time and money, and in terms of our primary outcome, we got nothing? Or would they try to spin it? In 68% of cases, they spun. There was spin in the abstract, which is like the summary of the article, and this is particularly alarming because the abstract is often the only part of the article people actually read. And so no wonder the media often gets it wrong. Spin in the abstracts can turn to spin in the press releases and results in spin in the news. Therefore, even if journalists are doing their due diligence, using the original abstract conclusion in good faith, they still run the risk of deceiving their readers. Researchers presenting new findings could always be careful to stress how preliminary the findings may be, but let's be serious. Powerful self-interests may prevail. Finally, though, I think the biggest problem with the way media reports on medicine is the choice as to which stories are covered. In 2003, SARS and bioterrorism killed less than a dozen people, yet generated over 100,000 media reports, far more than those covering the actual greatest threats to our lives and health. In fact, ironically, the more people that die, the less it appears something is covered. Our leading #1 killer is heart disease, yet it can be prevented, treated, and even reversed with diet and lifestyle changes. Now that is something that deserves to be on the front page. Most deaths in the United States are preventable and related to nutrition. According to the most rigorous analysis of risk factors ever published, the Global Burden of Disease Study, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the #1 cause of death in the United States, and the #1 cause of disability in this country, is our diet, which has bumped tobacco smoking to #2. Smoking now only kills about 500,000 Americans every year, whereas our diet now kills hundreds of thousands more. So if most death and disability is preventable and related to nutrition, then obviously nutrition is the #1 thing taught in medical school, right? It's the #1 thing your doctor talks to you about. How could there be such a disconnect between the science and the practice of medicine? Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine yourself a smoker back in the 1950s. The average per capita cigarette consumption was about 4,000 cigarettes a year. Think about that. In the 1950s, the average person walking around smoked a half-pack a day. The media was telling you to smoke, and famous athletes agreed. Even Santa Claus cared enough about your throat to want you to smoke. I mean, you want to keep fit and stay slender, so you make sure to smoke, and eat lots of hot dogs to keep trim, and lots of sugar to stay slim and trim, a lot less fattening than that apple there. I mean, sheesh. Though apples do connote goodness and freshness, reads one internal tobacco industry memo, which brings up many possibilities for making youth-oriented cigarettes. They wanted to make apple-flavored cigarettes for kids. In addition to staying fit and slender and soothing your throat for digestion's sake, you smoke. I mean, no curative power is claimed by Philip Morris, but hey, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Better be safe than sorry, and smoke. Like eating, smoking was a family affair. Gee, Mommy, you sure enjoy your Marlboro. You're darn tootin'. Just one question, Mom. Can you afford not to smoke Marlboros? In the 1950s, your kids were giving you cigarettes. Even your dog was giving you cigarettes. Blow in her face, and she'll follow you anywhere. No woman ever says, no, there's a round so firm, so fully packed. After all, John Wayne smoked them until he got lung cancer and died. Back then, even the paleo folks were smoking, and so were the doctors. Now, this is not to say there wasn't controversy within the medical profession. Yes, some doctors smoked Camels, but other physicians preferred Lucky, so there was some disagreement. Eminent doctors on high and impartial medical authority call for Philip Morris. Even the specialists couldn't agree which cigarette was better for your throat. So best to stick to the science, and more scientists smoke this brand. This should not be rocket science. But even the rocket scientists had their favorite for the man who thinks for himself. We know why the AMA may have been sucking up to the tobacco industry, refusing to endorse the Surgeon General's report on smoking after they were handed a $10 million check from the tobacco industry. But why weren't more individual doctors speaking out? Well, there were a few gallant souls ahead of their time, writing in as there are today, standing up against industries killing millions. But why not more? Maybe it's because the majority of physicians themselves smoked cigarettes. Just like the majority of physicians today continue to eat foods that are contributing to our epidemics of dietary disease. What was the AMA's rallying cry back then? Everything in moderation. Extensive scientific studies have proven smoking in moderation, oh, that's fine. Sound familiar? Eating the standard American diet today is like being a smoker back in the 1950s. Most everyone you know eats this way. It's normal. It's what they feed people in hospitals, for gosh sake. But you don't have to wait until society catches up with the science again. Sometimes it takes a whole generation for things to change in medicine. The old guard of smoking physicians and medical school professors die off, and a new generation takes its place. But how many patients need to die in the interim?